Hey guys, I'm Ben, and welcome to another episode of Albums Ranked. On today's episode, we'll be tackling the biggest band in the metal firmament, the legends themselves, Metallica. So obviously there's no need to really go into the history of the band because, that's been tackled ad nauseum on many different programs and documentaries over the years. But of course, the impact of Metallica cannot be denied. They're the band that every non-metal fan knows and associates all metal with, to the chagrin of most real metal fans. They are credited with spearheading the thrash metal movement and for bringing the more extreme end of heavy metal in general to the masses, to a point far beyond any of their influences and contemporaries, and have literally inspired like multiple generations to pick up guitars and get into rock and metal. In my own life, I first heard Metallica when I was only around 8 years old in 1987. My friend who lived next door to me had an older teenage brother who had just bought Master of Puppets. And I remember I was playing with my friend and suddenly heard this crazy music blasting out of his brother's room. I was, really shocked by it, but also intrigued. His brother was actually like a really cool kid, and when he saw I was interested, he would let me come into the house and into his room and listen with him. And he showed me some other stuff, and it was really cool. Anyway, that was the beginning for me with heavy music. I didn't buy any music until some years later, but I remember the first Metallica thing I ever got was a live bootleg, which was basically all Kill 'Em All stuff. And even though it was a bootleg, I thought it sounded absolutely amazing, and I remember playing the shit out of it. When I was around sort of the age of 12, 13, it was on just constant rotation. Soon after that, when I started collecting CDs, I actually got all those classic albums, up to the Black Album, and they were one of my earliest favorite bands for most of my teen years as well. Even when I got into grunge, I never stopped loving Metallica, and even once I had grown out of the grunge bands, with a few exceptions like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, I still really loved those albums that I'd grown up with. Metallica represent a bit of a contradiction for me though, in that on the one hand, I've always been happy for them that they became so mega successful and that that it was kind of one of our bands that made it, that kind of thing. However, they also are, I have to say, one of the bands from my youth that kind of broke my heart as well, with the absolute shit we were subjected to from them through the 90s and beyond. Which, contrary to me feeling happy for them to have succeeded, also made me kind of hate them for abandoning the badass metal that I loved from them. Then, of course, we all saw the many meme-worthy, cringy moments when the band exposed themselves in some kind of monster movie, and of course the credibility dent they took, especially Lars, during the whole Napster thing. Wherever you sit on that subject, you can't deny that they definitely took a big hit during that period of time, and of course the whole sexually ambiguous image they adopted, mostly Kirk and Lars again through the 90s, that sucked. And going for, from the sort of tight as a virgin live performances that they were known for to kind of like becoming a bit of a sloppy mess, especially, Lars and Kirk again seem to be letting the team down. I think all of this worked to push them out of my favorites list, and they've never really returned to being one of my favorite bands of the day. That being said, I think they seem to have made a more concerted effort in more recent years, ever since Death Magnetic, to really recapture the fire both on record and live. And the fact that even though they are all multi-squillionaires, now, and they really don't have to try anymore, I do respect and admire that they felt compelled to lift their game again and also try to get closer to their roots, even if the results are a bit hit or miss for me. Anyway, guys, so today I'm gonna rank their 10 original studio albums. So no compilations or cover albums or collaborations or any of that shit. So coming in at the bottom at number 10, and in my opinion, these two bottom albums are just bloody fucking awful, and I hate them both equally. But I'm actually less familiar with this one as I never bought it until recently just to complete my collection, and that's 1996's Load.
Mama will try and break me.
So, this album represents everything I hated about the generic hard rock of the 90s. It's meathead, uninspired crap. At times, they reminded me of what Merciful Fate was doing in the 90s. And, they are huge Fate fans, so maybe they were taking some cues from them, who knows. But where Fate made it sound killer and interesting and fucking awesome, Metallica just sounded stale and lame and like they'd had their balls hacked off. This album just makes me think of all the most cringe elements of 90s pop culture, and I fucking hated it with a passion at the time. I've tried recently to go back with an open mind, and while it's not as terrible as I remembered it to be, I certainly don't need to ever hear it again. So that one's at the bottom. Next, and not far behind in the ninth spot, is Load's horrible twin sister album, 1997's Reload. So I know most people would probably put these two albums in reverse order, but I'm actually a little more familiar with Reload. I actually didn't mind that song, The Memory Remains, at the time. I know a lot of people hate that song, but I don't know, something about it just sort of, I was like, oh yeah, I kind of like it. Na 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 na. I don't know, I kind of like that, but anyway. So I was kind of determined to like the album, so I gave it some attention back then. But really, even though it has some decent stuff and even a few cool moments here and there, overall, the same problem that Load has is present. Just feels generic and uninspired and so not the Metallica I'd grown up and fallen in love with. I felt cheated at the time because, I felt like they were jumping onto the bandwagon of that period in music and culture when up until that point, they had created the bandwagon that others were jumping onto. And in case any of you will complain that bands have a right to change their sound and do whatever they like, well, I actually 100% agree, but it only works if the music is inspired and interesting. If it's just trying to be hip with the times, then it's the very definition of selling out, Anyway, Load and Reload, in my opinion, can both fuck off. Anyway, next we have coming into the 8th spot, everybody's favorite punching bag, Saint Anger. So the funny thing is, I really don't hate this album anywhere near as much as I hate Load and Reload. And the reason for that is that even though there is plenty of suckage on Saint Anger, I feel that the band, while imploding, actually put their hearts and souls into this album. And it's, at the very least, a genuine effort. I think if the infamous snare sound wasn't present, and also if Kirk had ripped some, you know, killer solos across the album instead of doing none, then perhaps this album, would have been far less maligned. I feel like the album does have some cool riffs and energy to it. That was at least the band trying to be heavy again, even if for the most part they fell on their faces. I really don't hate this album, and I even enjoy it. I even enjoyed it when it first came out. Although that being said, I spun it again recently, and I couldn't really go the distance. It's pretty rough. I see it as a bridge album for the band, from the total musical and personal abyss they'd come from to their rebirth into eventually reclaiming their credibility as a metal band to some degree. So, number seven for me is the most recent album, and that's 2016's Hardwired to Self-Destruct. So this is a kind of strange one for me. When I heard the album, I thought, okay, cool. They've continued on from the style they developed for Death Magnetic, but with better production. And yeah, when I occasionally put this album on, I can definitely enjoy what the guys are offering, but I find that the songs just don't stay with me at all. Even though songs like Atlas Rise and Moth to the Flame are pretty good, and the standard is pretty consistent across the album, but I just, it just doesn't come close to the albums that made them who they are. It's a good album, and I respect them for getting closer to their thrash roots again, but it's not one of their best. It's good, but not great. So next, in the sixth place, we have 2008's Death Magnetic. So this album is far from perfect, but I remember when it came out, I was by that stage, so far off the Metallica bandwagon that when I picked it up, and yes, I did buy it out of loyalty, I was totally expecting to hate it. But I was shocked at how much I actually liked it. It was thrash again and heavy, and the songs were memorable with plenty of great guitar dual lines and harmonies. The solos were back, and I was like, holy shit, Metallica can still kick ass. Now, I think it's like, giving a starving man a cracker and he thinks it's the best thing he's ever tasted. In hindsight, Death Magnetic, has diminished and the cracks became, more clear to me as I got over my shock of not hating the album. Everyone talks about the shit production of Saint Anger, but what the fuck was Rick Rubin thinking? It seems just amateurish how much this album is clipping all over the place, and it makes repeated listenings of this album too taxing, and eventually I got sick of the album because of that sound. Going back now, though, I can say that I really dig the actual music. The riffs are pretty basic, but there's plenty of them, and they're well put together, and it's pretty bloody heavy. Lars is, typically kind of ham-fisted at times, but that's part of the Metallica sound, and let's be honest, it always has been. I really like the first half of the album in particular. All those songs rip, and Cyanide is also pretty great. But it's all pretty consistent. For me, this is far more memorable and kicking than Hardwired, and this is really the only modern Metallica album that I still think about these days. Next, we get to the business end of the list, the top five. Okay, so coming in the fifth place is 1991's self-titled album, better known as the Black Album. So, this is perhaps one of the most divisive and controversial albums in metal history. For many of the original thrash fans, this was a massive letdown and seen by many as the band selling out. For many others, this was an introduction to the band and to metal in general and was a gateway to heavier and darker music in general. Personally, I absolutely loved this album when it came out, mainly because I wasn't a thrash fanatic at the time, not like not like I am these days, much more into thrash. But I saw them on this tour, and they absolutely kicked ass. It was one of the best shows I'd ever seen at that point. I remember when I picked this album up, it was soon after I'd bought that bootleg I'd mentioned earlier, and even though it was completely different, I was hooked on both. To 12-year-old me, I wasn't concerned with any notions of them selling out. I just heard a great sounding album that was loaded with hooks that implanted themselves deep into my psyche. With songs like Sad But True, The Unforgiven, Wherever I May Roam, Through the Never, Nothing Else Matters. Damn, the whole album just had me totally captivated for years. With all that being said, however, I do find that now, and for quite a lot of years now actually, I find the album hasn't aged that well for me. Maybe I just got burned out on it after playing it, 500 billion times. Plus, hearing some of the singles way too many times on the radio has kind of ruined them a bit. Perhaps it's the fact that I would eventually fall in love with heavier stuff and found this too safe these days. Perhaps it's the fact that I can play the whole album from top to bottom in my head. I'm not really sure, but I almost never put this album on these days. If I made this list when I was 15, it would have been number one. But these days, it's lost its luster for me. And even though I still respect and will defend this album because I don't give a fuck what people say, it's a great fucking album, I'm just kind of past it at this point in my life. So next, we have number 4, 1988's And Justice for All. Now, again, if I made this list when I was 15, this would have been a very close second for me because I adored this album when I was a kid. Blackened is still one of their best songs, in my opinion, and even though it's been played to death, One is also still one of their greatest tracks, in my opinion, and that video clip still gives me chills. It used to scare the shit out of me as a kid, and I fucking loved it. I still do. This was their most proggy affair, and I think they had the chops and the songwriting power at that time to pull off the longer songs for the most part. But of course, you can't talk about Justice for All without talking about Jason and how he got fucked over in the mix by Lars. As a bass player myself, I just don't get it. What were they thinking? There are a few versions on YouTube with guys playing the bass lines, and they sound awesome. Jason was a great metal bass player in Flotsam and Jetsam, and they completely buried him here. And these days, when I go back to this album, I find it hard to stomach, especially after hearing the versions on YouTube with the bass. It just sounds so much better. I just wish they would give us an updated mix with Jason audible. Come on, guys, bloody do it. Anyway, this album, sorry, also hasn't really aged as well for me. I still have a lot of nostalgic love for it, but I find that I almost never go back to it these days. I find some of the longer tracks a bit meandering too, and some of Lars's drums are, a bit loud. Um, it was a great album back in the day, but like Black, it has lost a bit of its shine for me. So, here's where things really get tough, and the top three are sometimes a bit interchangeable for me, and have flip flopped a lot over the recent years to some degree. But I have to place them, so here we go. Coming in at number three is 1986's mighty Master of Puppets. So, what can be said about this absolute metal classic that hasn't already been said countless times by countless others? It's a perfect album. Of course, you have their original bass maestro, Cliff Burton, and man, I think they really lost such an important ingredient when he died. Of course, everyone has endlessly speculated about what direction the band would have taken had Cliff lived, but who the fuck really knows? Maybe they would have gone like full hardcore fucking polka music. Anyway, my favorite tracks are the absolutely slaying Battery, the epic Master of Puppets with its mix of power and beauty, and the highly emotive Sanitarium. But really, there are no weak spots on this album, and as I said, it's perfect. The band were in red hot form at this time, and they were already the kings of thrash by this time as well. Even though some die-hard douchebags had already begun calling them sellouts. I know for many this would be number one, and I would totally not blame you for thinking that. It's a bloody masterpiece. Absolutely love it. Next in the second place position is the band's almighty 1983 debut beast, Kill 'Em All. So here they took what bands like Motorhead and other new wave of British heavy metal bands had done and launched it into orbit. This is the blueprint for thrash metal, and it's just an absolute perfect metal album. There's no let up at all. A non-stop barrage of high energy, youth, potency at its raw and rough best. James sounds like he's in the middle of going through puberty at times, with his voice breaking all over the place. But with songs as killer as Hit the Lights, one of my all-time favorites, if not my favorite Metallica song, The Four Horsemen. My favorite version actually was the bootleg I had. It just sounded even heavier and darker, and just it was so awesome. I just wish I knew what happened to that thing. I lost it a long time ago. Man, it drives me insane. But anyway, then you've got like the mighty neck breaker Whiplash, the firestorm of No Remorse, and the killer Seek and Destroy. all make this album just pure, perfect, badass, and I love it so damn much. It's so, so killer. Um, I also had like the Cliff and Maul DVD, VHS, and man, I still love watching those guys when they're in their earlier incarnation, just ripping on fire with Cliff. Um, I didn't realize when I bought that bootleg as well that it was basically just a live version of this album. But these songs have been with me the longest, and they've stood the test of time, and have only really grown in my estimation and admiration. It's a drop dead thrash metal classic, and I absolutely love it. So obviously, everybody knows what my favorite Metallica masterpiece is. It's 1984's perfect and killer Ride the Lightning. Here, the band still had some of that youthful exuberance hanging over from Kill 'Em All, but already it had been further refined and distilled to absolute perfection. From one of my favorite openers in the juggernaut of heaviness, Fight Fire with Fire, to the epic saga of the title track, and I love Kirk's leads in that one, so tasty. The drop dead classic riffs for Whom the Bell Tolls, the sublime, powerful bliss of Fade to Black. Then you've got Trapped Under Ice and Escape, which always get overlooked, but I love them both. They rip hard too. And of course, the almighty Creeping Death is another one of their true classics. The Call of Cthulhu is the instrumental, and it's my least favorite track, but I still adore it, and always have. It's killer. This is Metallica at their absolute perfect best. Heavy, melodic, and powerful, but also with the energy of a young, hungry band still oozing through every second of it. And for that reason, it's been my number one for many years now. Anyway, guys, there you have it. Metallica will always have a warm place in my heart and are a milestone band in my own discovery of heavy music. And even though I don't spend much time with them these days, I'll always love the mighty Metallica. So, guys, how would you rank these albums? Do you agree with my takes, or do you think it's all a bunch of bullshit? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, guys, if you like the video, hit the subscribe buttons and go to my channel for more classic hard rock, heavy metal, thrash metal, and extreme metal content over there. So, thanks for joining and watching, guys. Stay metal, and see you next time.